What happens when a simple security guard discovers he possesses abilities that defy everything science tells us is possible? When Marcus Thompson took his job as a royal guard at Buckingham Palace, he thought his biggest challenge would be standing still for hours in the London rain. He never imagined that one terrifying moment would awaken something inside him that would change not just his life, but the lives of millions around the world. In an age where everything is recorded and shared instantly, Marcus became the most watched person on Earth in just 24 hours.
But fame wasn't what he wanted. The power flowing through his hands wasn't something he asked for.
And the responsibility that came with it was more than any ordinary man should ever have to bear. This is the true story of how a quiet young man from Manchester became the guardian angel the world never knew it needed. A story captured on countless cameras, witnessed by thousands, and verified by scientists who still struggle to explain what they saw. This is the story of Marcus Thompson, the royal guard who discovered that sometimes the most extraordinary power comes to the most ordinary people. But power like this comes with a price. And Marcus was about to learn that being special doesn't always mean being safe. Marcus Thompson had always been the kind of person who blended into crowds. At 28 years old, he stood 6 feet tall with brown hair that he kept neatly trimmed and eyes that seemed to notice everything while revealing nothing. His friends often joked that he could disappear in an empty room, which made his choice of career somewhat ironic. As a royal guard at Buckingham Palace, his job was literally to be seen, to stand perfectly still for hours while tourists took photos and children tried to make him smile. He had been working at the palace for 3 years when everything changed. Marcus came from Manchester, where his father worked in construction and his mother taught primary school. Growing up, there was nothing unusual about the Thompson family. They lived in a modest terraced house, went to church on Sundays, and spent their holidays at seaside towns along the English coast. Marcus was an average student who played football reasonably well and dreamed of becoming a police officer like his uncle David. But life had other plans. When Marcus turned 21, his uncle David was killed in the line of duty during a robbery that went wrong. The loss devastated the family, and Marcus found himself questioning whether law enforcement was really the path he wanted to follow. Instead, he drifted through several jobs, working at a warehouse, then as a security guard at a shopping center, before finally finding his way to the Royal Protection Service. The training was rigorous. Marcus learned about crowd control, threat assessment, and the precise protocols that governed every aspect of palace security. He studied the history of the royal family, memorized floor plans, and practiced standing motionless for hours at a time. His instructors noted that he had excellent attention to detail and an unusual ability to remain calm under pressure, qualities that made him ideal for the role. His daily routine was predictable and, to most people, would have seemed incredibly boring. Marcus would arrive at the palace at 7 in the morning, change into his immaculate red uniform with its gleaming buttons and tall black hat, and take his position at one of the designated posts around the palace grounds. For 8 hours, he would stand guard watching the endless stream of tourists who came to see the changing of the guard ceremony and hope for a glimpse of the royal family. Marcus actually enjoyed the work more than he had expected. There was something peaceful about the routine, and he found that the long hours of standing still gave him time to think and observe. He began to notice patterns in the crowd, recognizing regular visitors and spotting potential troublemakers before they caused problems. His supervisors appreciated his reliability and attention to detail, and Marcus felt proud to be part of an institution that represented centuries of British history and tradition. On the morning of October 15th, everything seemed perfectly normal. London was experiencing one of those crisp autumn days that made the city feel alive with possibility. The leaves on the trees along the Mall were turning golden and red, and there was just enough of a chill in the air to make people walk with purpose. Marcus took his position at the main gate, where crowds always gathered to peer through the iron railings at the palace beyond. The morning passed without incident. Tourists snapped photos, children pressed their faces against the bars of the gate, and Marcus maintained his stoic expression while internally cataloging everything he observed. He noticed an elderly Japanese couple who were taking turns photographing each other in front of the palace. A group of American university students were excitedly discussing their plans for the rest of their London visit. A young mother was trying to convince her toddler to look at the guard instead of the pigeons that strutted across the courtyard. It was just after 11 o'clock when Marcus first noticed the man in the dark jacket. There was something about him that stood out from the typical tourist crowd. While everyone else was looking toward the palace or taking selfies, this man seemed to be studying the guards themselves, watching their movements and timing their rotations. He was tall and lean, with short black hair and sunglasses that he wore despite the fact that the day was not particularly bright. Marcus had been trained to trust his instincts, and something about this man made him uneasy. The stranger stayed longer than most tourists, and he seemed particularly interested in the security arrangements rather than the historical significance of the palace. Marcus made a mental note to keep watching him, but the man eventually moved on, disappearing into the crowd of tourists heading toward St. James's Park. The changing of the guard ceremony began at 11:30, as it did every day. Marcus watched from his position as his colleagues performed the elaborate ritual that had been refined over centuries. The tourists crowded closer to the railings, phones and cameras raised to capture the pageantry. The sound of marching feet and military commands echoed across the courtyard, mixed with the excited chatter of onlookers in dozens of different languages. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should when Marcus noticed the man in the dark jacket had returned. This time, he was not alone. 3 other men had joined him, and they were standing near the edge of the crowd, closer to the palace railings than before. Something about their positioning and the way they kept checking the time made Marcus's training kick into high alert. He began to reach for his radio to report the suspicious activity when everything went wrong. The explosion came without warning. One moment, Marcus was watching the changing of the guard ceremony, and the next, the air was filled with smoke, screaming, and the terrible sound of metal being torn apart. The blast seemed to come from somewhere near the main entrance, and Marcus felt the shock wave hit him like a physical blow, making his ears ring and his vision blur. Training took over immediately. Marcus's first priority was to assess the threat and protect the civilians in the area. Through the smoke and chaos, he could see that part of the palace railings had been destroyed, and debris was scattered across the courtyard. People were running in all directions, some injured and bleeding, others simply terrified and trying to escape what they assumed was a terrorist attack. Marcus began moving toward the source of the explosion, speaking into his radio to coordinate with other security personnel. But as he ran through the smoke, something extraordinary began to happen. He could feel a strange warmth building in his chest, spreading through his body like electricity. At first he thought it might be adrenaline or shock from the blast, but the sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced. When he reached the area where the explosion had occurred, Marcus found a scene of devastation that was worse than he had feared. The blast had been powerful enough to tear through the metal railings and send chunks of stone flying through the air. Several tourists had been caught in the explosion, and Marcus could see at least a dozen people who were seriously injured. A young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, was lying motionless near the twisted remains of the gate. Her parents were kneeling beside her, crying and calling her name, but she was not responding. Blood was pooling beneath her head, and Marcus could see that she had suffered severe injuries from flying debris. Other emergency responders had not yet arrived, and Marcus knew that without immediate medical attention, the child would not survive. Without thinking, Marcus knelt beside the girl and placed his hands on her head, trying to assess the extent of her injuries. The moment his skin made contact with hers, the strange warmth he had been feeling intensified dramatically. It was as if an electric current was flowing through his hands, and he could feel something happening that defied all logic and explanation. The girl's parents watched in amazement as the bleeding from their daughter's head wound began to slow, then stop entirely. Color returned to her pale cheeks, and her breathing, which had been shallow and irregular, became stronger and more steady. Within minutes, she opened her eyes and looked up at Marcus with confusion but no apparent pain. Marcus himself was just as shocked as everyone else. He stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else, trying to understand what had just happened. The warm energy was still flowing through him, stronger than ever, and he could feel it calling him toward the other injured people scattered around the courtyard. Moving almost without conscious thought, Marcus went from victim to victim, placing his hands on their wounds and watching in amazement as injuries healed before his eyes. A man with a broken arm felt the bone knit itself back together. A woman with severe cuts on her face watched in a mirror held by a friend as the wounds closed and disappeared, leaving unblemished skin behind. Each healing seemed to come more easily than the last, as if Marcus was learning to control and direct the strange power flowing through him. Within 30 minutes, every person who had been injured in the explosion was completely healed, not just improved or stabilized, but perfectly healthy, with no trace of the injuries they had suffered. The emergency medical teams that had finally arrived found themselves with nothing to do except stare in bewilderment at patients who showed no signs of trauma despite clear evidence of a serious explosion. But Marcus barely noticed the amazement of the medical personnel or the growing crowd of onlookers who were witnessing something that should have been impossible. He was focused entirely on trying to understand what was happening to him and what it meant. The power flowing through his hands was unlike anything he had ever imagined, and he could feel it growing stronger with each passing moment. Word of what had happened spread through the crowd of tourists and bystanders faster than wildfire. In an age where everyone carried a camera in their pocket, dozens of people had recorded the entire sequence of events. Videos began appearing on social media within minutes, showing Marcus moving from victim to victim and performing what could only be described as miraculous healings. The palace security team was faced with a situation for which no protocol existed. How do you handle a royal guard who appears to have developed supernatural healing abilities? Marcus was quietly escorted inside the palace, while officials tried to figure out what to do next. The media was already gathering outside the gates, having picked up the story from social media, and questions were being asked that no one knew how to answer. Marcus found himself in a small, windowless room deep within the palace, still wearing his guard uniform, but feeling like his entire world had been turned upside down. The warm energy was still flowing through him, and he could feel it responding to his emotions, growing stronger when he was calm and focused, and becoming chaotic when he was stressed or confused. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the palace physician, was the first official to speak with Marcus after the incident. She was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and intelligent gray eyes who had spent her career treating members of the royal family and dealing with sensitive medical situations. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she was about to witness. Dr. Hartwell began with standard medical questions, checking Marcus's vital signs and asking about his mental state. But when she noticed a small cut on her own hand from where she had caught it on a door handle earlier that morning, Marcus asked if he could try something. Before she could object, he had gently touched the wound, and she watched in stunned silence as it healed completely, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. The implications of what had happened were staggering. Marcus Thompson, an ordinary royal guard from Manchester, had somehow developed the ability to heal injuries through touch. The power seemed to be real, repeatable, and growing stronger. But how was such a thing possible? And what did it mean for Marcus's future, and the future of everyone around him? As word of the incident reached higher levels of government and the royal family itself, decisions were being made that would change Marcus's life forever. The world was about to meet the royal guard with the power to heal, and nothing would ever be the same again. The videos went viral within hours. By evening, footage of Marcus healing the explosion victims had been viewed millions of times across every social media platform. News organizations around the world were running the story as their lead item, and the palace switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from reporters, scientists, religious leaders, and ordinary people who wanted to know if what they were seeing was real. Marcus sat in the small palace room, watching the news coverage on a television that had been brought in for him. He could hardly believe he was looking at himself on the screen, moving from person to person, and somehow healing their injuries, with nothing more than his touch. The reporters were calling it everything from a miracle to an elaborate hoax. But Marcus knew the truth was far more complicated than either explanation. The power inside him had not diminished since the incident. If anything, it seemed to be growing stronger and more responsive to his thoughts and emotions. When he concentrated, he could feel it flowing through his hands like warm water, and he found that he could direct it with increasing precision. But the ability came with sensations and knowledge that he did not understand, as if the power itself was teaching him how to use it. Dr. Hartwell had been joined by a team of specialists from some of the most prestigious medical institutions in the country. They ran test after test, trying to understand how Marcus's abilities worked and whether they could be scientifically explained. Blood samples, brain scans, genetic analysis, and every other type of medical examination they could think of, all came back completely normal. According to medical science, there was nothing unusual about Marcus Thompson except for the fact that he could heal people by touching them. James Morrison, a neurologist from Cambridge University, was perhaps the most persistent in his attempts to find a rational explanation. He had spent his entire career studying the human brain and was convinced that Marcus's abilities must have some basis in neurology or psychology. Perhaps the explosion had triggered some dormant area of his brain, or maybe the healing was psychosomatic, caused by the victim's belief that they were being healed rather than any actual physical change. But every test Dr. Morrison conducted seemed to disprove his theories rather than support them. When Marcus healed a broken bone in a laboratory setting, X-rays clearly showed the fracture disappearing in real time. When he worked on patients who were unconscious and had no idea what was happening, the healing occurred just as effectively as it did with people who were awake and aware. Whatever was happening when Marcus used his abilities, it was definitely real and definitely physical. The government was facing an unprecedented situation. Within 24 hours of the Palace incident, delegations from countries around the world were requesting meetings with Marcus. The World Health Organization wanted to study him. Religious leaders were proclaiming him everything from a saint to a sign of the apocalypse. Scientists were demanding access, while security experts worried about what would happen if hostile forces tried to kidnap or exploit him. Marcus himself was struggling with the attention and the implications of his newfound abilities. He had never wanted to be famous or special. All he had ever wanted was a quiet life where he could do his job well and maybe start a family someday. Now he was arguably the most important person in the world, and the weight of that responsibility was almost crushing. His parents had been brought to London under heavy security after reporters discovered their address and began camping outside their Manchester home. Margaret Thompson, his mother, was a practical woman who had always taught her son to help others whenever possible. When she saw what Marcus could do, she was amazed but not entirely surprised. She had always known there was something special about her son, even if she could never have imagined it would manifest in such an extraordinary way. His father, Robert Thompson, was more skeptical and worried about what this attention would mean for their family. He had worked hard his entire life to provide a stable, normal home for his wife and son, and he was afraid that Marcus's abilities would make a normal life impossible. The security arrangements alone were already disrupting their daily routine, and Robert worried about what would happen when the initial excitement died down and people began to see Marcus as a resource to be exploited, rather than a person to be protected. The first formal test of Marcus's abilities was arranged by the Palace medical team, in cooperation with Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. A group of young patients with various serious conditions were brought to a secure location where Marcus could try to help them, while being monitored by teams of doctors and scientists. 8-year-old Sarah Chen had been born with a rare genetic condition that prevented her bones from developing properly. She had undergone multiple surgeries and faced a lifetime of pain and mobility problems. When Marcus placed his hands on her legs, the assembled medical team watched in amazement as her bones began to strengthen and straighten before their eyes. Within an hour, Sarah was walking normally for the first time in her life, her genetic condition apparently completely corrected. The healing of Sarah and the other children at Great Ormond Street was recorded and verified by multiple independent medical teams. Blood tests, genetic analysis, and detailed physical examinations all confirmed that the children had been genuinely healed, not just temporarily improved. Whatever Marcus was doing, it was rewriting their bodies at the cellular level, correcting genetic defects and healing damage that medical science had considered permanent and irreversible. The implications were staggering. If Marcus could heal genetic conditions, what else might be possible? Could he cure cancer, reverse aging, or even bring people back from the brink of death? The medical community was buzzing with excitement and speculation, while governments around the world began to consider the political and economic implications of a world where serious illness might become a thing of the past. But Marcus was beginning to understand that his abilities came with limitations and costs that others did not yet realize. Each major healing left him physically and emotionally drained, and he was starting to sense that the power flowing through him was not unlimited. More troubling was his growing awareness that he could feel the pain and suffering of sick people around him, even when they were trying to hide it. The ability seemed to be making him more sensitive to human suffering rather than less, and the emotional burden was becoming difficult to bear. Security around Marcus was increased dramatically after intelligence services learned of several plots by various groups to kidnap him. Some wanted to force him to heal their leaders or supporters, while others saw him as a threat to the natural order that needed to be eliminated. The palace had become a fortress, with armed guards and surveillance equipment protecting every entrance and exit. Dr. Hartwell had become something of a liaison between Marcus and the outside world, helping him understand what was happening to him while protecting him from the most aggressive demands for access. She was one of the few people who seemed to see him as a person rather than a medical phenomenon, and Marcus found himself relying on her guidance as he tried to navigate his new reality. It was Dr. Hartwell who suggested that Marcus might want to try healing himself from the small injuries and fatigue that came with his demanding new schedule. Marcus had never thought to turn his abilities inward, but when he concentrated on a paper cut on his finger, he found that he could heal it just as easily as he could heal others. The discovery opened up new possibilities and new questions about the nature of his power. 3 weeks after the palace explosion, Marcus made his first public appearance since the incident. A carefully orchestrated press conference was held at the palace, with representatives from major news organizations around the world in attendance. Marcus sat at a simple table, wearing his civilian clothes rather than his guard uniform, and faced a room full of cameras and questions that would determine how the world would see him going forward. The questions came rapidly. How did his abilities work? Could he teach others to heal the way he could? Was he connected to any particular religion or belief system? What did he plan to do with his power? Marcus answered as honestly as he could, explaining that he did not understand how the healing worked any better than the scientists who were studying him, and that he felt a responsibility to use his abilities to help as many people as possible. But the most important moment of the press conference came when a reporter asked Marcus to demonstrate his abilities. Dr. Hartwell had arranged for a volunteer, a young man named David Park, who had lost his left arm in a motorcycle accident 2 years earlier. David had agreed to participate in the demonstration after being thoroughly briefed on what might happen and what the risks might be. The room fell silent as Marcus approached David and gently placed his hands on the scarred area where the arm had been amputated. The cameras zoomed in, and millions of people around the world held their breath as they watched through their screens. For several minutes, nothing seemed to happen, and Marcus could feel sweat beading on his forehead as he concentrated harder than he ever had before. Then, slowly, impossibly, David's arm began to grow back. It started as just a small bump beneath the skin, but gradually took shape, developing bones, muscles, nerves, and finally skin. The process took nearly an hour, during which the room remained completely silent except for the sound of cameras clicking and the quiet sobs of David's mother, who was watching from the front row. When it was over, David flexed his new arm and moved his fingers, testing the sensation and mobility. The arm was perfect in every way, indistinguishable from his original limb, except for the fact that it was slightly paler, having never been exposed to sunlight. David wept openly as he hugged his mother with both arms for the first time in 2 years, and there was not a dry eye in the room. The footage of David's healing was watched by over 1 billion people within 24 hours, making it one of the most viewed videos in internet history. The demonstration had proven beyond any doubt that Marcus's abilities were real and incredibly powerful, but it had also raised new questions about the extent and limitations of what he could do. Religious groups around the world began to interpret Marcus's abilities according to their own beliefs. Some saw him as a manifestation of divine power, while others worried that he represented a challenge to the natural order established by God. Several cults began forming around him. Despite his repeated requests that people not worship him or treat him as anything more than a person who had been given an unusual gift, scientists were equally divided about what Marcus represented. Some believed that his abilities proved the existence of forms of energy and biological processes that science had not yet discovered. Others maintained that there must be a rational, materialistic explanation for what he could do, even if they could not yet identify it. A few suggested that Marcus might represent the next step in human evolution, a glimpse of what humanity might become in the future. The economic implications of Marcus's abilities were also becoming clear. Pharmaceutical companies saw their stock prices plummet as investors worried about what would happen to the medical industry if serious illness could be cured by a simple touch. Insurance companies were scrambling to figure out how to handle claims related to Marcus's healings, and governments were trying to understand what his abilities would mean for their healthcare systems and budgets. But for Marcus, the most difficult part of his new life was the constant stream of requests for help. Every day brought thousands of letters, emails, and phone calls from people around the world who were suffering from various illnesses and injuries. They sent photos of their conditions, shared stories of their pain, and begged him to heal them or their loved ones. The sheer volume of human suffering that was being laid at his feet was overwhelming, and Marcus struggled with the knowledge that he could help only a tiny fraction of the people who needed him. The palace medical team was working with the government to establish protocols for who could receive Marcus's help and under what circumstances. Priority was given to children and to cases where conventional medicine had failed. But even with these restrictions, the demand far exceeded what Marcus could possibly provide. He was already working 12 to 14 hours a day, healing as many people as his strength and emotional reserves would allow. But it was never enough. Dr. Hartwell was becoming increasingly concerned about Marcus's physical and mental health. The constant use of his abilities was taking a toll, and she could see that he was losing weight and showing signs of chronic fatigue. More worrying was the way he seemed to be absorbing some of the emotional trauma of the people he healed, as if their pain was becoming his pain in some fundamental way. Late at night, when the palace was quiet and the crowds of reporters and security personnel had dispersed, Marcus would often sit alone in his room and wonder if he was strong enough to carry the burden that had been placed on him. The power flowing through his hands could heal the sick and injured, but it could not heal the loneliness and isolation that came with being the only person in the world who could do what he did. He missed his old life, his routine duties as a royal guard, and the simple pleasure of being anonymous in a crowd. But every time he considered walking away from it all, Marcus would think about the children at Great Ormond Street, or David Park flexing his new arm, or the little girl at the palace who had been dying until he touched her. He would remember the gratitude in their eyes and the joy of their families, and he would know that he could not abandon the gift he had been given, no matter how difficult it was to bear. As Marcus drifted off to sleep each night, he often wondered what tomorrow would bring, and whether he would be strong enough to face it. The world was watching, millions of people were counting on him, and the power in his hands continued to grow stronger with each passing day. But with that power came a responsibility that no one person should ever have to carry alone, and Marcus was beginning to understand that his greatest challenge was not learning to control his abilities, but learning to live with them. 6 months after the palace explosion, Marcus had become the most famous person on Earth, but he felt more isolated than ever before. The small room in Buckingham Palace had been replaced with the entire wing that served as his living quarters, medical facility, and office space. Security teams monitored every entrance and exit, while doctors and scientists continued their endless studies of his abilities. The world outside wanted to know everything about him, but Marcus often felt like he was disappearing beneath the weight of their expectations and demands. The healing center that had been established at the palace processed hundreds of applications every day from people seeking Marcus's help. A team of medical professionals reviewed each case, prioritizing based on severity, age, and the likelihood that conventional medicine could provide effective treatment. Despite working 10 hours a day and healing dozens of people each week, Marcus could help less than 1% of those who requested his assistance. Dr. Hartwell had become more than just his physician. She was his confidant, advisor, and often the only person who seemed to understand the emotional toll that his abilities were taking on him. She had noticed that Marcus was developing an almost supernatural sensitivity to human suffering, able to sense illness and pain in people around him even when they showed no outward signs of distress. One particularly difficult day began when Marcus was asked to visit a children's hospital where conventional medicine had reached its limits for several young patients. The first child was a 4-year-old girl named Emma Rodriguez, whose immune system had been destroyed by leukemia treatments. She was so weak that she could barely lift her head from the pillow, and her parents had exhausted their savings on medical bills while watching their daughter slowly fade away. When Marcus placed his hands on Emma's frail body, he could feel the disease coursing through her blood like poison. The healing process was more intense than usual, requiring him to channel energy for nearly an hour, while her parents and the medical team watched in tense silence. Gradually, color returned to Emma's cheeks and her breathing became stronger. When the process was complete, Blood tests showed that her leukemia was completely gone, and her immune system was functioning normally for the first time in over a year. But healing Emma had drained Marcus more than usual, and he could feel a strange resonance between his own energy and hers, as if part of her suffering had transferred to him during the healing process.